And so if you guys will go ahead. Thank you.
Let me see. Okay. Thank you, Linda. And I want to give a special shout out today to our Board of Adult Education member, Eric Sills, who is here running our Zoom account. So we are experimenting. This whole thing is a big experiment that you were part of, that you did not consent to, or that you consent to by your presence with us. But we have a really cool piece of new technology called an owl that Eric has introduced to us. As you can see, the owl is a piece of technology that it's a speaker and a camera, and it will zoom in to anyone that is speaking. If it can locate where, it probably can't with the microphone, but if it can locate where you're speaking, it'll actually zoom into you. It'll make different panels so that we can see so that whoever is watching at home can actually see who is speaking at the time. And it has this panoramic view up top so you can see everything here. So it's a really cool piece of equipment. And if someone does join us via Zoom, they can actually participate with us, and we can hear them through the speaker that the owl has as well. So in the weeks ahead, if you're not able to join us in person, you can join online, so long as the technology, internet, and the people running those things hold. So actually, we have somebody joining us right now. Look at this. You can see it in real time. Oh, I see. Okay, awesome. So we're really excited about this, and this is a soft launch of this technology. So the Board of Adult Education over the last, oh my gosh, how long have we been talking about this? Yeah, for a long, long time. I think well before then. We were talking about the challenge of regathering a community that had been scattered for so long. Ironically, we thought that in the fall we would be regathering and we would be able to have this conversation. What we thought might be a good sort of place to root a community that has been dispersed for so long are the covenants that this community has made to God, and to one another. And there are 4 covenants within United Church of Chapel Hill's history, starting with the Open and Affirming covenant that establishes our commitment to our LGBTQIA neighbors. And of course that language, since the O&A covenant was founded, the language around what that covenant means has expanded over time. There is an economic justice covenant. There is a racial truth, justice, and reconciliation covenant. And there is a creation covenant as well. That is actually the one that we affirmed, we have most recently affirmed as a community. So we're actually going to go through each of those 4 covenants over the next few weeks and talk about sort of where they came from, where they are now, and how we might envision ourselves living into those covenants moving forward. In some cases, we may want to even update the language around them, as with the O&A covenant. But we may just want to recommit ourselves to the covenants as a community. And so what we thought would be a good way to orient ourselves to this conversation is to think, before we get specific with what the covenants are at United Church of Chapel Hill, to think sort of theologically and biblically about the significance of covenant within the biblical tradition, the significance of covenant within the Christian tradition as a whole, and the significance of covenant within our community, specifically at United Church of Chapel Hill. And I thought that I would assemble the brightest theological minds that I've had the pleasure of working with, these 3, so that we can have just a conversation about those things today. So our structure is pretty loose. I'm going to pose some questions that the four of us are going to have the opportunity to reflect on. And then we're going to take a break where you all get to gather with each other. You can go and read the covenants, actually, if you want, along the wall here. They're all in the back. So there's the creation covenant, the economic justice covenant. You can see them there. You all will have an opportunity to engage with each other about the importance of these covenants, and then we'll all gather back for a sort of Q&A session. We really appreciate your willingness to be here. So thank you. So, my friends, yes. Oh, yes, Mary Elizabeth, will you read that for us?
During worship, Ian realized that one of the lines of one of the hymns was so very relevant to what we were doing, and they asked me, so I took note of it. So here we go. Let's see, it's zoomed oddly. Okay. My not glasses. We are not free. I can't do this. It's too small. We are not free when we are confined to every wish that sweeps the mind, but free when freely we accept the sacred bounds that must be kept. Let's hear that again. We are not free when we are confined to every wish that sweeps the mind, but free when freely we accept the sacred bounds that must be kept. That, my friends, is all I need to say about covenant today.
Well, thank you for remembering that. I mentioned that in worship. This is why you have to have friends like that who will remind you of things that you say. But I think that that sense of sacred boundaryness is sort of a good framing for what covenant means within the biblical tradition, the Christian tradition, and our tradition here at United Church of Chapel Hill. So I think that that's sort of the ways that I want to frame the conversation. I'm just curious about, in your biblical study, and particularly as we've been thinking about this series that we're going to have on covenants, what has come to your mind as you've been thinking about the biblical tradition of covenants and the significance of those?
I really appreciate using the language that we are a covenantal people, and there's a difference between being creedal and covenantal. And I, as many of you know, have come out of a Baptist tradition that is really similar to the UCCH tradition. They're all out of sort of this congregational system that values covenant over creed. And so there are churches where you must submit to a creed in order to be a member, where you must say, I believe this. I believe that Jesus rose on the third day, and I believe, this, and this. And the Apostles' Creed is one of the creeds, but churches often have creeds that you must say that you believe in order to be a member. When I was in college, I was a Bible study leader in InterVarsity, and I know that sounds crazy because they have a creed that I actually edited and both refused to sign and edited. And they somehow still let me be a Bible study leader, but I think they just tolerated that until I graduated. But that's really important. Like, I say that as a sort of a funny story, but that's really important because I think that we must be able to engage in covenant with each other without being bound by creed that limits what our ability to trust the Spirit to teach us, that limits our ability to be open to learning new things from God. So as a people, I think it's helpful for us to articulate that we are a covenant people and that is different from being a creedal people.
I was reflecting, thank you, I appreciate that. I was reflecting on this in I think the first sermon that I preached out of the women's lectionary. We had just started engaging with Wilda Gaffney's work, and I was struck by the ways that as we were talking about sort of the Abrahamic covenant, the covenant that God makes with Abraham, that I began to realize that, that covenant was an expanding covenant. Throughout the course of Scripture, you can sort of see there's this tension, this question about what about those people? Do they count? Can they be part of this covenant? And the answer is always yes. Yes, those people can be part of this covenant. And I thought particularly about Hagar and the encounter that she had with God in the desert, and the ways in which, any covenant that God had with Abraham and Sarah and Isaac also had room for the commitment and the covenant that God made with Hagar and with Ishmael in the desert. And it reminds me a little bit of the work of Ellen Davis, who's a Hebrew Bible scholar at Duke. I think Mary Elizabeth was one of her students, right? Yeah. She talks about, and we'll get maybe more into this with the creation covenant, but she talks about the fact that, there are covenants older than the one that God made with us, that God's first covenant was with creation itself, and that any, there's often a reading of Scripture that says that we're just to go and dominate the earth and subdue it and all this sort of stuff. But that in reality, that actually translates better as skilled mastery, is what she says, and that skilled mastery is always and ever framed by the covenant that God first made with creation itself. And so there are both covenants that are older than ours, and there are covenants that are outside the bounds of that we draw in ours. And I think that expansive sense of covenant really roots us in a more liberative understanding of the covenantal commitment that we make with one another and with God. That we should always be open to the ever-extending or ever-expanding love of God and reflected in our covenants and outside of our covenants. So there's a way in which we're making room always for something that we have missed, which is what I really love about United Church of Chapel Hill, is that I think we are a people really committed to drawing a circle wide for us and for others too. We're always open to the possibility that there are those among us that we have left out and excluded. And God's sense of covenant, the biblical sense of covenant, the Christian sense of covenant, the United Church of Christ and UCCH sense of covenant says that we are always to redraw those boundaries if we ever see that we have left someone out of the covenant of God's grace. So,
well, I just want to say that the approach that we have had as a church with the covenant has been more, this is my understanding, more about a prophetical action of covenants through the means of a prophetical action. That this is not a romantic covenant on everything will be fine. Our covenants are responding to a social and prophetical need. LGBTQ, Earth Ministries, we're all oriented to our response as a church. What is our covenant as a church based on these situations that are publicly happening? And I remember when we were discussing in the racial one, there were many conversations. I know you will remember those. You remember those conversations, and it was not easier because there was a lot of back and forth comments. But we get in that agreement of that this is what it looks like what we really commit to be. And this is our response to the problematic that is happening in the world. So, and I think that's takes a different take from Wade, and going back to what you said about the Bible, and the first really person the first, let's say, character in the Bible who takes this concept of covenant, this is God, and the same with the rainbow covenant. I'm gonna make covenant with you all. So, which is a different approach. What I'm saying is that our covenants are so embedded in our ethos that that really reflects who we have been in through the years since we start this practice of putting in right what we covenant to.
You all are making me think about so many things. And there's so many directions we could take this conversation. I really appreciate what everybody has said here. The first thing that I thought when Ian posed the question was about how covenant is really the organizing metaphor of Scripture, especially the Old Testament. So why covenant? Why do we have this language of covenant? Well, aside from the cross, I can't think of a more potent and enduring metaphor in the life of the church if you really take the Old Testament seriously. Because Genesis is all about creation, then with Sarah and Abraham, the establishment of the covenant. Of course, with Noah, you have this really powerful image of the rainbow as a sign of God's faithfulness to God's covenant. And then, Exodus is all about God's faithfulness to the Hebrew people as they seek a new home and deliverance from their captivity. And then the historical books, Samuel and the kings, God's faithfulness to the people as the nation of Israel is being created. And then you just keep going and going. The writings, in the Old Testament, Ruth is all about God's faithfulness to God's covenant, set in the particular narrative of her life. Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you die, I will die. And then the end of the Old Testament, the prophets are outraged about how Israel has not lived into the covenant that God has established. So, if you just think about the Old Testament, if you're looking for like one organizing principle for the Old Testament, you can think about it in terms of this covenant. And then if you want to add the New Testament in there, you can see the New Testament sort of as a great renewal of God's covenant. I talked to the confirmands about this whole tension between being a Creedal church and a covenantal church, as Mary Elizabeth was describing. And I think one of the reasons we try to lean in toward this language of covenant is that it respects your personhood and your will, and it's a way of acknowledging that God's people have choices to make. It's not about whereas a creed might be less flexible, more legalistic. You've got to believe the words on the page. A covenant gives us some choices to make in the context of these promises that God has established. It's also time specific. It's not meant to be merely timeless. This gets to the sense of renewal, and renewability. God is making new this covenant every day. We can make choices every day that live into this covenant. So I kind of have a negative reaction when there are more sort of like legalistic ways of talking about the covenants that we have as a church. In my position, sometimes people come to me and say, believe it or not, but we have this covenant, and what are you doing about it right now? And I don't know what to say. I don't know. I'm living with it in the way that I live with my husband. Every day I'm trying to show up for that that covenant, and every day we have choices to make. And I think the O&A covenant, as Ian was saying, was a great example of an opportunity for updating, an opportunity for thinking about what it means for us today, because you can really see how our commitments to LGBT people are interpreted differently in 1993 or so than they might be interpreted today. We have new language, we have new knowledge, we have new understanding. So the covenant itself is not, a creed that we sort of mindlessly utter. Rather, it is a promise, and we're looking for ways to be responsible to it and faithful to it, and that might mean reaching for some new language or finding some new ways to live into it today. And I don't think that's just true for O&A, but that is one where, I think everybody can see some of the shortcomings of the language and that kind of thing that you might want to, or that we might, as a body of people, find new ways to engage. I know you had some more to say. Sure.
Just because you know me.
Do what?
I said just because you know me.
Oh, yeah. Well, I can feel you.
Something came to mind for me, which is that one of the covenant, most of the time when I talk about covenant, or we talk about covenant in the Old Testament, we are talking about this beautiful ark with the story of Abraham, Moses, and Noah, this beautiful ark. But there's a specific covenant in the Bible that's called the mitzvah, and it says, "The Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent one from another," if you want the poster version of it. And that poster version of it does actually hang in my house, this beautiful, fancy writing. But that covenant is not about, it was given to me as a wedding gift. When we are absent one from another, may the Lord watch between us. And that's not what it is about, because that is a covenant about people about violence, warring, coming together, making a covenant that even as they parted, that they would keep the peace. And so I think that it's helpful to imagine the ways that our covenants also help us to keep the peace when we are in different places and when we are working on hard things.
Yeah, something I would like to add that probably is more on the other side of this is that covenants, as I understand this, they're more organic and more dynamic. They're not like an image of Moses coming down from the mountain and having those written, like covenant written in stone, which is more than dynamic. We make them based on human beings and behaviors and hopes, and I think the LGBTQ ONA covenant is the perfect example of how organic, how dynamic is this concept of creating covenants at church. But sometimes we understand this is the covenant, is like a second or the third testament of the Bible, and we shouldn't touch it, right? It's more about what you are saying is how we understand this covenants in the base of our new realities. Is this new reality is demanding from us a new conversation, a new having new conclusions, and probably looking from a different scenario, from a different, having a balcony vision of this, how this looks like today in today's world. And I think that's the beautiful thing about covenants, is how dynamic and organic they are.
Yeah, I love what you said about the covenant being dynamic. And I always think that you have to apply the Bonhoeffer question to the covenant. Bonhoeffer's central question is, who is Christ for us today? What's this covenant mean for us today? In light of recent events, in light of where God has brought us, So, you know, can adapt the Bonhoeffer question to each of our covenants.
Well, as you can see, covenant, when you begin to explore covenant, you're exploring a lot of different things. I mean, I hear that covenants are a reflection of God's faithfulness to us. I hear that covenants are a reflection of the commitments that we're making in action, in deed, and not just in word, to be a certain kind of people. I hear in covenants a kind of dynamism and a flexibility, an openness to the changing nature of the world and of the community that we're building together and the community that surrounds our community, the world in which we find ourselves as a community. And I knew that this would be a rich conversation. And I knew that these folks would have some really wise things to say, but we also know that the covenants at United Church are a reflection of our Congregationalist commitments, and that you all have a lot to say about covenant as well. So I want to give us about 10 minutes or so, maybe a little less than, for you all to group with each other. You're free to do so however that feels natural for you, to just engage in some conversation about what covenant means for you, what you're taking away from what you're hearing, what questions you still have. And you're welcome, if you would like, to just go review the covenants that are right behind us here. And we'll regather in about 10 minutes for some Q&A from you all so that we can continue the conversation, widen the circle with each other. Okay? So let's take about 10 minutes together.
I can talk. I'm not sure if you'll hear much. It's not bad. Okay. Yeah, the background noise has gone down a lot. I'm not sure if that's just because people have moved away or if you're doing something over there. Not really. Most of what I remember from confirmation was Jill kind of like leading us through discussions on like what is faith and sort of stuff like that.
You ready? Let, let's take just another moment to wrap up where our conversations are, and then we'll gather back together. All right, friends, I think we'll conclude our time together with just a little conversation in the big circle. One of the things we've discovered as a board is that when we give you all the opportunity to break out into discussion groups, you don't want to come back, which is a really great sign of the fact that, first of all, that we kind of like each other enough to, to have these conversations, and that you all have really rich things to say. So I'd love to hear some feedback from what you're hearing, what you're taking away, any questions that you have lingering with you.
This group got into the sort of the question of the type of covenants that we have created at this church over the last 20 years. Was that part of a trend in terms of making a value statement in the form of what we call the covenant that happened to be popular 20 or 30 years from now, is continued among more congregational churches? I mean, is it possible that other churches might have taken similar stands and called it something else? Or that we may have done covenants 50 years ago about racial equity that have sort of just got lost in the archives since then. Is this just a new media for making stand?
That's really interesting. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't know the answer to your question. I don't have any experience or knowledge of other UCC churches that have gone through the structured processes that United Church has and really set out these prophetic-driven statements, as David was saying. You know, a challenge comes along, and we want to say something faithful about it, and so the church goes through in my experience, that's unique to United Church of Chapel Hill.
Didn't the impetus for the open and affirming covenant come from the national denomination? And so that was an idea that we took and implemented. But then the economic justice covenant, I'm learning in preparation for next Sunday. People from our church took that to the Southern Conference, and the Southern Conference adopted it. And then it was taken to Synod, and the whole UCC adopted it, and there was a task force that encouraged other churches to.
Well, if you put it that way, I think you're right, Linda. In the United Church of Christ, General Synod is held every 2 years, and most of the resolutions that come before General Synod reflect a process of discernment that arises from a local church. Then they take it to their regional conference. Then it goes before a committee of the General Synod, and in a very similar manner, you know, what begins as a first draft of a statement then gets refined, and then eventually it goes before the Synod for an up or down vote. So denominationally in the United Church of Christ, I mean, yes, we have General Synod resolutions on all of these subjects and more, as often as they come up in the life of the church. And you could think of them as covenantal statements. I wasn't thinking in those terms, but you're exactly right about that.
Well, I think I'm just thinking about it because I had been looking at the history of the Economic Justice Covenant, and it seemed like they were specifically encouraging other churches to go through a similar process. And
so in that regard, you know, the covenants that are reflected here aren't so unique. You know, lots of UCC churches do similar things, and if we got really, if something was happening in our community, or if we had a group of people in our congregation that were really responding to something taking place in the world, like, I don't know, the war in Ukraine or something like that, and we were organized enough to put our thoughts and prayers down in writing, you know, we could bring that forward as a General Synod resolution and ask for the whole church to adopt a similar statement. Another thing I really like about covenants is that they can be time specific, you know, they're time bound. All these covenants have a date on them, you know, that tells you something about what was going on in the life of the church and the world. So to me, thinking historically, you can't really separate our open and affirming covenant from the AIDS crisis. You know, it came really at the end, the later years of the AIDS crisis, when a lot of mainline Protestant people, you know, knew men who had died of AIDS or knew families that had been touched by this. Racial justice similarly. I mean, the 2010s were, you know, a decade where we really have been thinking so much about racial justice. So they're not just time specific, but they can also be very like place specific. You know, they're very reflective of a community's context and what matters to a community and the kind of prayer and reflection that a community has about it.
I want to kind of go back to the question of covenants and definition, because you talked about resolutions and you talked about statements and we talked about covenants, but those things are not the same to me. And so a covenant to me conceptualizes what's happening as a different thing. It's about a relationship with God and we're making promises. Whereas a statement is more like a creed. It's like, I believe this and this is what we're going to do. It's like a plan of action, but not necessarily, there's no necessarily any sacred commitments going on there. So I was just wondering whether, as other churches went through like the O&A process, whether they thought of them as covenants or did they think of them as more like statements of equity or something like that?
I agree, and all I would say, I agree with you, Barbara, and what I would say is that the language we use matters. You know, we can frame our work together however we would like, and I think it's a conscious choice that brings a certain value set and approach when we use the language of covenant. I think it reflects some humility. I think it reflects some of the dynamism and the possibilities of renewal. And I think that it's not just like an action statement. Sometimes in the United Church of Christ, we talk about these dual ideas. There's like covenant and then there's autonomy. Covenant is the sense of we're doing things together and we're in relationship with each other. Autonomy is the value of like local contextual control and decision making. A friend of mine says that covenant is when I want you to do something that you don't want to do. And autonomy is when you want me to do something that I don't want to do. But I think that when we use the language of covenant, it brings along some connotations of prayer, humbleness, dynamism. That it matters how we frame our work together.
Well, Chapel Hill is big on planning, making, 10-year plans, 20-year plans. And we've just done that in the past decade. But the meetings and discussions and processes, the group interactions have some things in common with what we're talking about now.
Something I mentioned to some of the staff during the break is that we're deliberate in using the term covenant rather than contract. And just wondering if you all would like to talk a bit more about that distinction.
Well, I certainly, I think that at the heart of every covenant is a relationship. And there is certainly a certain kind of relationship that one can form with another in a contract, but it is a relationship that is a sort of exchange. Whereas a covenant is a commitment to be in relationship with one another in this dynamic and ever unfolding mystery that is our relationship with one another, whether that's a marital covenant or a covenant that the church makes with another church to form a denomination, or whether it's the covenant that we make in being members with one another. It reminds me of a really beautiful practice that I think was Cameron's idea, if I'm not mistaken, when I arrived to the church. And we decided that not only would the confirmands write a statement of faith that's reflective of each of these groups as they age, as they come of age in this rite of passage, but that would sort of become the covenant by which all new members for the rest of that year would join our church. And you are not. If you become a new member, we're going to have Confirmation Sunday on May 1st. And if you become a member on May 8th, you're going to read the statement of faith that the confirmands have written for May 1st. But that doesn't mean that the next year that there won't be a new set of confirmands that come up with a new statement of faith. And so there is a kind, what you're covenanting to is not a fixed mindset or a fixed belief system. What you're covenanting to is the community that's going to walk with you as you carry the questions that are on your heart, and as you hold gently the answers and the conclusions that you've come to in the context of this moment. My sense of racial justice today is very different than it was 10 years ago. And I know that that's probably the same for many of you because we've been in a lot of classes together where our sense of our commitment to racial equity has expanded or shifted and changed. So to me, at the heart of what we're doing is forming a relationship. And that is not contractual, that's covenantal. It's more reflective of the reality that we are rooted in, that we are created, and that we have been invited by the Creator into co-creation. And so that is very different than a fixed contract. And actually, it's a lot messier. And I think that this is something that we sometimes miss in liberal churches. We have a sense of, you can go to any evangelical church and they have a tab on their website that says what we believe. And it is clear and it is simple and it has all the, footnotes that go to the right scripture passages, and they have just done all that sort of work for you, and it's easy to reference. But what we have done as a community is to create a very messy commitment to accompany one another along the journey to the answers that we have today that might be different than the ones that we had yesterday and will probably be different from the ones that we come to tomorrow. But we're making a commitment with each other and with God, not to the contract itself.
Just a quick comment. To me, contracts are negotiated and covenants are offered. That feels different. Offered.
A contract is a zero-sum game. You will give me so-and-so much, and I will give you something else of equal value. A covenant is like an infinite sum game where you and I and the others, I will give to all of you something, and I will get from all of you the same thing, and we'll all be richer.
I love that. And as someone who just signed a lease for a place in Raleigh, I will tell you that is not an equal exchange. But anyway, housing crisis notwithstanding, any other thoughts or from anybody?
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for coming today, and especially thank our pastors for this very rich presentation and conversation that we've had. And I hope you'll all come back next Sunday and talk about the economic justice covenant that we have. And see you then.